Hi there, the day that was never supposed to happen on December 3, 2024. Something happened that JPMorgan Chase had been trying to prevent for 15 years. And this time, it was completely out of their control. That day, JPMorgan received a delivery notice for 5.2 million ounces of physical silver. But this was not an ordinary delivery request. These contracts could not be delayed. They could not be settled in cash. They could not be ignored. This was a direct violation of how the system is supposed to work, because the entire COMEX silver market is built on one single assumption. No one actually wants the metal. Everyone takes the money in the end. But at the $59 level, that assumption died, and JPMorgan found itself trapped inside a system it had helped design. Now pause for a moment and think about this. How do we usually see futures markets? As places where real goods are bought and sold, where real supply and demand set real prices, right? But that's not how it actually works. According to COMEX data, historically about 95% of silver futures contracts are never settled with physical metal. In other words, if there are 100 silver contracts, only 5 people actually want the metal. The other 95 take their profit or loss and walk away with dollars. For banks, this creates an incredibly comfortable situation, because if only 5 out of 100 people ever ask for delivery, then in theory you can do this. Sell promises for 100 units of silver while holding only 5 ounces in the vault. This is fractional reserve banking applied to precious metals. You promise delivery to everyone, knowing statistically that no one will show up. And for decades, this system worked perfectly. Why JPMorgan took control of the vaults, but JPMorgan wasn't just part of this system. They became the system's gatekeeper. Between 2010 and 2020, JPMorgan turned into the largest vault operator on COMEX. Now ask yourself this: why would the biggest bank in America want to hold warehouses full of silver bars? The answer is simple and unsettling. Whoever controls the vaults controls delivery, and whoever controls delivery controls the heart of the market. On the rare occasion when someone stepped forward and said, "I actually want the metal," JPMorgan didn't need to go out and find new silver. They simply shifted metal between their own vaults from the eligible category to the registered category. On paper, it looked like abundant supply. In reality, not a single new ounce entered the market. From the outside, everything appeared fine. But underneath, the system was slowly being hollowed out. And then something happened, something that never made headlines, yet changed everything. The quiet but deadly shift. June 2021. A regulation quietly went into effect within the global banking system, one that almost no one was talking about. Basel III. It started in Europe, then gradually spread across all major markets. Buried inside these rules was a classification change that looked extremely technical, even boring, but its impact was devastating. Unallocated precious metals, that is, metal claims that aren't assigned to a specific person, metals that exist only on paper. These assets were removed from Tier 1 status and downgraded to Tier 3. So what did that actually mean? Simply this: banks could no longer treat paper metal promises as high-quality assets. If you held a silver derivative, you now had to back it, not with another piece of paper, but with real, physical metal. The fractional reserve game was shut down by international banking law. There was no press release, no big announcement, but the math changed. And that change made it impossible for JPMorgan to continue the strategy it had relied on for 15 years. They understood it immediately. The market didn't, at least not yet. Why $59 was the breaking point. $59. For many people, it looks like just another number. It's not even round. It's not 100, not even 50. But in financial systems, some numbers matter less because of math and more because of psychology. 69 isn't one of them. 59 is. Because $59 was never just a price level for silver. That level was the weakest link in the chain. It was a balance point, carefully built over years by banks, large funds, and commodity derivatives markets. And that balance rested on a fragile compromise between real metal and paper metal. That compromise quietly said this: silver can rise, but only this far. The invisible math behind $59 in futures markets. Prices don't form only through buyers and sellers. They're shaped by dozens of invisible variables: open interest levels, margin requirements, bank risk models, hedge fund leverage ratios. The $59 level represented a critical threshold, especially for institutions carrying large short positions. Above that level, margin calls began. Collateral stopped being sufficient. Holding paper silver positions became increasingly expensive. In other words, above $59, the price was no longer manageable. That's why strange things always happened whenever silver approached that level. Sudden sell-offs, abrupt spikes in trading volume, sharp drops within minutes. This wasn't natural market behavior. This was a line being defended, a trauma the system never forgot. 1980. At this point, a ghost that haunts the financial world inevitably appears. The 1980 silver crisis. When the Hunt brothers tried to corner the silver market, prices spiraled out of control. What happened then was burned into the memory of banks, and the system made a silent vow: never again. The $59 level was the modern version of that collective memory. A safety barrier, an alarm line. If crossed, it risked triggering a chain reaction. Short squeezes, Physical delivery, demands, a widening gap between paper markets and real markets, and worst of all, loss of control. $59. Not a price, but a signal. That's why $59 was never a target. It was a signal. Crossing that level would have sent a clear message. The market is no longer playing by your rules, and financial systems fear loss of control more than anything else. Miners, China, and the silver flowing east. While silver prices were being debated in the West, something far quieter and far more deliberate was unfolding elsewhere in the world. It wasn't announced loudly. It didn't make headlines. It wasn't discussed on television. But tons of silver were flowing east. The changing role of miners in the past, miners simply extracted metal and sold it. They didn't care much about who bought it. Today, that's no longer the case. Large mining companies now understand something very clearly. Silver is not just a commodity. It's a strategic resource, and strategic resources are not sold the same way to every buyer. Western banks typically use silver through paper contracts without ever taking delivery of the real metal. But the East, especially China, India, and Southeast Asia, wants physical metal. China's silent strategy. China never announces, "We're accumulating silver." China doesn't talk. China acts state-backed companies, intermediaries, long-term supply agreements, all moving slowly, quietly. But the result is clear. A significant portion of mined silver never returns to Western markets. Vault doors close, warehouses fill, metal is removed from circulation. And this doesn't show up immediately on price charts. The Eastern perspective. For the East, silver is inflation insurance, a critical industrial input and physical protection against financial system risk. For the West, it's often just a trading instrument. That difference in mindset creates tension over time. One side says, "I'm selling," the other says, "I'm storing." And that imbalance cannot last forever. Industrial panic and real demand. For a long time, when people talked about demand in the silver market, they meant investors, charts, ETFs, futures, but there was a major piece missing from that story: industry. A world without silver isn't possible. It's nearly impossible to imagine a modern world functioning without silver. Solar panels, electric vehicles, semiconductors, medical devices, defense systems. Silver is inside all of them, and in many cases, there is no substitute. For these industries, silver may be expensive, but it is not optional. The moment reality set in 4 years, companies operated under a simple assumption: there's always supply. Then one day, they noticed something else. Inventories were thinning. Delivery times were stretching. Even when prices stayed flat, metal wasn't available. That's when panic began. Because for industry, the problem isn't price, it's access. Real demand is quiet investors talk when they buy. Industry stays silent. But its demand is large, continuous, and unavoidable. This kind of demand doesn't cause sudden spikes on charts. It hollows out the foundation quietly, until one day, it becomes clear. There is no real metal left to sell. And that's when the system realizes something fundamental. Paper markets can create demand, but they cannot create metal. That distinction is what separates silver from many other commodities. Paper, silver, and physical reality. At some point, everyone is forced to face the same question. What is real? In the silver market, that question is especially uncomfortable. Because the distance between the price you see on a screen and the metal you can actually hold keeps growing wider. On one side, there is paper silver, contracts, agreements, ETFs, futures. On the other side, there is physical silver. It has weight. It enters warehouses. It can be held in your hand. And for a long time, these two worlds pretended to be the same. How paper silver grew this large. Paper silver was a perfect tool for the system. Because it could be created without limits. It provided liquidity. It allowed price control. Real silver is finite. But paper silver is just a keystroke away. Over the years, the amount of silver traded on paper grew too many times the amount of silver ever mined on Earth. Was that normal? No. But as long as the system worked, no one asked the question out loud. Where the problem began. The problem started the day people didn't just want to buy silver, they wanted delivery. And in that moment, the system had to face a simple truth. If everyone asks for metal at the same time, there isn't enough metal. Most paper silver holders were never going to see real silver, because the system was never designed for that. This was a secret everyone knew, but no one talked about. Physical reality does not wait. Financial narratives are flexible. Contracts can be rewritten. Rules can be changed. But physics does not negotiate. Either the metal exists, or it doesn't. That simple fact is the greatest weakness of the paper-silver world. And as the system tightens, that weakness becomes harder to hide. JPMorgan and the reality of delivery. The name JPMorgan carries weight in the financial world. Not just because it's large, but because it sits at the center of the system. In the silver market, that name is never mentioned by accident. Vaults and responsibility for years. JPMorgan managed some of the largest silver vaults in the world. This is not just storage, it's a promise. It means saying, if requested, I will deliver. That promise feels safe when the system runs normally. When delivery demands rise, at some point, things change. Delivery requests increased. Contracts stopped closing on paper and started asking for metal. And this is the hardest scenario for banks, because banks usually act as intermediaries. As balancers, they rely on flow, not large physical stockpiles. But when flow breaks, the system is exposed. Why JPMorgan became the focus. The market began to realize something. If these deliveries are real, this is no longer just about price. This was a test of the system's internal mechanic, and JPMorgan stood right at the center of that test. That's why everyone watched, quietly but closely. This is not an accusation. This point matters. This is not a conspiracy story. It is a structural reality. The system was built on the assumption that not everyone would demand metal at the same time. If that assumption breaks, the problem is not individuals. It's the design itself. The silent collapse scenario. Financial collapses don't always arrive with explosions. Sometimes, they arrive in silence. No one shouts. Headlines lag behind, but the ground begins to shift. How a silent collapse unfolds. At first, only small things change. Delivery times stretch. Premiums rise. Physical metal becomes hard to find, yet price charts still look calm. This is the most dangerous stage because people still believe the system is in control. Then behavior changes. Big players don't talk. They move. Metal is held, not sold. It's pulled out of circulation. This creates an invisible drought in the market. And one day, it becomes clear. The problem isn't price. The problem is trust. No one panics out loud. But everyone thinks the same thing. What if they can't deliver? That question touches the system's weakest point. Silver is not a price. It's a warning. This story may look like it's about silver, but it's really about money, about trust, about systems. Silver here is just a tool, a signal, a warning light. History always whispers the same lesson. Trust in money doesn't disappear overnight, but one day, it doesn't come back. Silver has been part of this story for centuries. It's quiet, unflashy, but it's always there. This is not a call to action. No one is telling you to buy. No one is telling you to sell. This is an invitation to notice, to see the gap between the number on the screen and the real world beneath it. Final words. Every system carries its own limit within itself. Sometimes that limit appears in the quietest place. Silver is not a price, not a chart. It's a warning. And warnings are most dangerous, not when they aren't heard, but when they are heard and ignored. If you made it this far, this story probably made you pause and think, maybe about prices, maybe about the system, or maybe about what real actually means. I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. Do you think the issue is silver itself, or is silver simply revealing something much bigger? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this gave you a new way to look at things, hitting like helps this message reach more people. And if you want more stories about hidden systems, quiet turning points, and the patterns behind them, don't forget to subscribe. Sometimes, the most important warnings are the quietest ones.